In the history of human civilization, empires were built with blood. To conquer a land, you needed soldiers, ships, and steel. But in the 21st century, the tools of empire have changed. The modern conqueror doesn't wear a uniform. He wears a tailored suit. He doesn't carry a sword. He carries a loan agreement. We are told that the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, the world's financial guardians institutions created to stabilize economies and end global poverty. But if you look past the press releases, you find a darker reality. Today, we are deconstructing the debt trap, a sophisticated system of global control that keeps developing nations in a state of perpetual servitude. This is the story of how aid became a weapon and how the invisible empire was built. To understand the present, we must go back to 1944. As World War II was ending, 44 nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their stated goal was to rebuild the war-torn global economy, but there was a fundamental flaw in the design. The system was built by the victors of the war to protect the interests of the victors. The voting scam. Unlike a democracy where every person has one vote, the IMF and World Bank operate on a quota system. Your voting power is determined by how much money you contribute. The veto power. The United States holds over 16% of the voting power. Since major decisions require an 85% majority, the U.S. holds a literal veto over the entire global economy. The Leadership Pact. By unwritten tradition, the head of the World Bank is always an American, and the head of the IMF is always a European. This isn't a global partnership. It is a financial cartel designed to ensure that the global North remains the board of directors, while the global South remains the customer. When a developing nation faces a crisis, perhaps due to a drop in commodity prices or a natural disaster, they turn to the IMF as a lender of last resort. But this money comes with strings attached. These strings are known as conditionalities. The IMF playbook follows 3 rigid steps. Austerity. They force the government to slash spending on the poor. This means cutting budgets for schools, hospitals, and food subsidies. Privatization. They demand the state sell off its most valuable assets, water, electricity, and telecommunications, to foreign private corporations. Deregulation. They force the country to open its markets to Western goods, often destroying local industries that cannot compete with subsidized foreign imports. Host. They call it fiscal discipline. In reality, it is a forced liquidation of a nation's sovereignty. How does a nation get into so much debt in the first place? Enter the economic hitman. This term, popularized by whistleblower John Perkins, describes consultants who intentionally create bloated financial forecasts. They convince developing nations to take out massive loans for infrastructure projects, dams, highways, and power plants that the country doesn't actually need and cannot afford. The loophole. The World Bank lends the money, but that money never stays in the country. It is paid directly to massive Western engineering firms like Halliburton or Bechtel to build the projects. The result: the Western company gets the profit, the Western bank gets the interest, and the developing nation is left with a massive debt and a project that doesn't generate enough revenue to pay it back. This isn't an accident. It is a deliberate strategy to ensure the country defaults, giving the lender total leverage over the nation's resources. Why are the most resource-rich countries often the poorest? Look at the World Bank's mining and energy policies. When a country defaults on its debt, the IMF and World Bank suggest that the country pay its debt by granting mining or drilling rights to international corporations at a massive discount. The wealth flows out of the ground into the hands of foreign shareholders and back to the banks in Washington and London. The local population is left with environmental destruction, poisoned water, and a bill they can never pay. The reality is, one of the most common IMF demands is currency devaluation. They tell the country that if their currency is cheaper, their exports will be more competitive. Exports. While exports become cheaper for the West, the country has to sell twice as much of its resources to earn the same amount of dollars. Imports. The price of fuel, medicine, and food, which are imported in dollars, skyrockets. The result: the local population sees their life savings vanish overnight. A person who worked 30 years for their pension suddenly finds that their money can't even buy a week's worth of groceries. Devaluation is a silent tax that transfers wealth from the poor of the global South to the consumers of the global North. Who are the architects of these policies? The revolving door between the IMF, World Bank, and private Wall Street banks is a well-oiled machine. Executives move from Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan to the U.S. Treasury, then to the IMF, and finally back to a private investment firm. Their loyalty isn't to the starving child in a developing nation. It is to the institutional creditors. They protect the system because they are the system. This isn't just theory. We have seen the IMF riot in dozens of countries. The 1997 Asian financial crisis. How the IMF's shock therapy destroyed the tiger economies of Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, allowing Western firms to buy their industries for pennies on the dollar. Latin America, the lost decade. How debt was used to crush social movements and install neoliberal regimes. Sub-Saharan Africa, where debt service payments are often higher than the entire national budget for healthcare and education combined. The IMF and World Bank serve as the enforcement arm of dollar hegemony. Because all these loans are denominated in US dollars, every country is forced to participate in the dollar-based trade system. This gives the United States the power to sanction or cut off any country that tries to rebel. You don't need to occupy a country with tanks if you own their central bank. Debt is the new colonialism. Is there hope? We are seeing the rise of alternative systems. BRICS and the New Development Bank. Nations are trying to build a system that is uncontrolled by Washington. Debt jubilee movements. Activists are calling for the total cancellation of debts for the world's poorest nations. Sovereignty. Countries are realizing that the only way to win the game is to stop playing by the IMF's rules. Conclusion. The IMF and World Bank were built to keep the world in a specific order. They have been incredibly successful. But as the world wakes up to the untold truth, the architecture of prestige is starting to crumble.